Red Dead Redemption 2 is an indisputable masterpiece, but when many players first start the game, they are surprised or even mildly annoyed to learn that their first 2 hours will be spent traipsing around in the snow. Rather than dropping the player in the midst of the action, Rockstar Games instead chose to begin this story in the unfortunate aftermath of some off-screen action. We are introduced to the gang of outlaws and oddballs at the heart of this journey for the first time as they push through a snowstorm in search of shelter. And within the first 5 minutes, one of their crew is already dead. Which is a shame, of course, since for all we know, Davey could have been the most fun and interesting member of the whole gang. As Red Dead Redemption 2's prologue progresses, grounded action sequences in isolated corners of the map help teach players the basic mechanics, while introducing the core cast of characters and several important story themes. The game successfully avoids overwhelming the player with the scale and depth of its world because it takes the idiom "you have to walk before you can run" very seriously and arguably a bit too literally. For the first 2 hours, gameplay is quite plainly slowed down as a result of the snowy terrain, necessarily insisting that you do walk more than run. The snow, then, is the mechanism by which Red Dead Redemption 2 controls the player's introduction to this world, preventing them from rushing past important details or tutorials, and insisting that they understand how the game works before they're set loose. It's not hard to see why many people consider this opening sequence to be a bit boring, but digging just a little bit deeper reveals how important this prologue is to the player's experience of the game, in the way it paces the introduction of mechanics, presents exposition without pretension, and sets the tone and rhythm before inviting the player to fully take over the reins.
Everybody, we're safe now. There ain't nobody following us through a storm like this one. And by the time they get here, well, we're gonna be long gone.
Just like most video game prologues, Red Dead Redemption 2's opening sequence had to accomplish a few very important things. Firstly, it had to introduce the player to the game's core mechanics. Secondly, it needed to establish the tone and lay the groundwork for the story. And thirdly, it had to hook the player in order to keep them playing past the first hour. That said, then, you could certainly argue that Red Dead Redemption 2's intro doesn't do a particularly good job of hooking in the player in the traditional way, with bombastic action and drama. I would contend, however, that Rockstar Games had earned the right to avoid front-loading their game with excessive excitement just to get people on board, because their pedigree as developers ensures that a high percentage of players will push through their game's prologue regardless of how slow it may or may not be. In an age where free trials and subscription services often offer a low barrier to entry, this slow opening tactic is increasingly dangerous for game makers. But in Red Dead Redemption 2, it was a brave choice that I truly believe paid off. The game begins with a series of titles establishing the time period, setting, and to some degree the tone, before fading from black into the image of a battered caravan of horses and carts making their way through a blizzard, in the apparent aftermath of a criminal endeavor gone very wrong. This gang of outlaws and misfits, which the player is soon to be part of, are low on supplies, on the run from Pinkertons, and seemingly almost out of luck. Nevertheless, they persevere thanks largely to the steadfast leadership of the charismatic mustachioed man Dutch van der Linde, and the enduring support of his right-hand man Arthur Morgan. Soon enough, the gang finds a place to make camp in the remains of an old mining town, before Arthur, Dutch, and the rabble-rousing, mischief-making menace Micah make their way further out in search of supplies. The player's first moments in control of the game involve keeping their horse on the right path through the snowy terrain, trudging towards a cabin, taking care of some of the O'Driscoll boys, and scavenging for delicious canned fruit and biscuits. Then they'll scrap with another thug in a nearby barn, calm an anxious horse down, and eventually leave the area with the cabin's justifiably frustrated former resident Mrs. Adler after Micah accidentally burns her home to the ground. The scene that Rockstar Games sets in this opening sequence is not a glamorous one, but it does successfully set the tone, introduce many of the key characters and themes in the story, and show the player some of the game's core mechanics. And far from being a simple backdrop to the action, the snow here has a direct impact on every step the player takes, because, once again, it is quite literally slowing them down, allowing the gameplay and the story to reveal itself bit by bit. The game also uses the snowstorm conditions to narrow the scope of the world, which will eventually open up into a grand, endlessly explorable landscape. Here at the beginning, though, the horizon is concealed by a wall of white, the shape of the terrain is leveled off with a blanket of snow, and the carefully placed tree line guides you along a singular path. Your eyes are drawn only exactly where the game wants them to be, to the men on their horses, to the lights, and the cabin ahead. By avoiding too many visual distractions, Red Dead Redemption 2 ensures that the player can focus on learning the basics. It shows you how to ride, how to shoot, how to interact with people, and it also forces the player to listen. While beating the O'Driscoll who jumps you in the barn, you learn about their plans to rob a train passing through somewhere nearby, thus setting up the great train heist which will serve as the climactic moment of the opening chapter of the game. And while Arthur is given the freedom to deal with this O'Driscoll however he pleases, it's made very clear here with the rescue of Mrs. Adler that however bad Dutch's gang might be, they're not nearly as bad as these O'Driscolls, and not nearly as criminal as they could be. Most of them do still have at least some morals. At the same time, it's clear that this band of merry outlaws is no longer in their prime. Not just because the world is increasingly out to get them, but also because there's obvious tension within the group. Arthur insists that he trusts Dutch, but he can't help but question his decisions as well. He cooperates with Micah, but he clearly and rightfully hates his guts too. And soon enough, as more of the gang are introduced in these opening snowy missions, it becomes clearer and clearer where Arthur stands and how he feels about everyone on the team. And it is arguably only because they are entirely isolated in their snowy little corner of the game's map that this dynamic is able to play out in a believable way. Tensions are heightened by their current predicament, and so much of this drama will fade into the background once they've all settled down somewhere warmer, but the player will always implicitly understand what is bubbling beneath the surface. This is a group who will spend the rest of the story struggling to survive and struggling to get along, as they watch the foundations of their way of life crumbling away beneath their feet.
You come with us. Arthur!
Yes, it's okay. We're bad men. We ain't them.
After returning from the burning cabin with a few supplies, some time passes before Arthur Morgan is sent out with Javier Escuela to find John Marston, the badass cowboy from the first Red Dead Redemption, who is a bit less badass here and a bit more of a bumbling idiot needing to be saved from a pack of wolves. After that rescue, then Arthur will help Pearson put some food on the table by hunting for deer with Charles, and he'll scout out and shoot up a nearby O'Driscoll hideout with Dutch and friends in order to gather the supplies they need to steal the train robbery out from underneath them. Because sometimes you have to steal from the thieves to rob from the rich to give to the poor outlaws. When the time finally comes to pull off the heist, you'll emerge from your snowy camp into a slightly less snowy area, where Arthur and Bill Williamson manage to mess up the plan with some shoddy detonator wiring, and Mr. Morgan will be required to jump aboard the train with Lenny and pull the brakes before the crew can finally blow open the doors to Colm O'Driscoll's private car and steal some bearer bonds. Then, and only then, will Dutch's gang finally be able to hit the road heading for greener pastures and leaving the snow behind. On paper then, there is plenty of interesting stuff going on in this opening sequence, but everything that does happen is contextualized by the unfortunate situation that Dutch's gang find themselves in as they lick their wounds in a snowbound ghost town. As you learn more about Arthur Morgan and his criminal buddies, the game continues showing you the ropes, sometimes quite literally, in this wintry microcosm of the wider open world. Once the player knows the basics, they'll then learn how to hunt, how to eat, how to climb, how to rob a train, and yes, how to use the ropes. All of these mechanics are gently introduced to gameplay in a way that feels entirely natural and never overwhelming. Focused routes through the snowy wilderness teach you everything you need to know to comfortably interact with the open world when you eventually earn the freedom to do so. Basically, again, the game is teaching you how to walk before it lets you run. And while you're learning how to play, you're also learning why you should play. Because every single journey is punctuated by conversations that explain who these outlaws are, how they got there, and what they want. Repeated mentions of the robbery gone wrong on the boat back in Blackwater allude to unexplained machinations that Arthur wasn't privy to but hopefully eventually will be. Talk of the money they left behind signals their imminent need for cash and an eventual desire to retrieve their stash once the heat has died down. References to the Pinkertons hunting their group suggest a formidable foe Arthur will almost certainly have to face down the line, and conflict among the ranks of Dutch's men indicates that the journey ahead will rarely be a smooth one. Most of these story elements are introduced through offhand comments and idle conversation that all feels very natural in this situation. And these chats give purpose to otherwise uneventful walks and rides through the landscape, while also signaling to the player that they should expect a lot more similar expositional chatter on their way to, from, and during missions. While it might be harder for the game to hold the attention of players later on when they can largely go where they wish, though, here in the opening, the snow keeps you on track and gives you little choice but to pay attention to what the cowboys around you are wittering on about. No details are forced down the player's throat, but every discussion reveals more about this world and gradually deepens your investment in Arthur and the gang. And on top of all that, Red Dead Redemption 2's opening sets the tone in a way that demonstrates to the player what they should expect from the experience going forward. As epic and as brilliant as Red Dead Redemption 2 is, its story does also play out in a much slower and more clunky world than Grand Theft Auto or the vast majority of other open world games. There is plenty of action and drama, but it is necessarily and appropriately pared back to fit within the time period and the scale of the adventure. And it makes sense that they would want to set expectations accordingly early on. The joy of playing Red Dead Redemption 2 is not found just in the opportunity to be a badass outlaw robbing trains. It also emerges from living in and interacting with a fully realized Wild West world. The game successfully gamifies every aspect of the Western experience to make it all feel incredibly fun. But given free reign from the start, more than a few players would likely default to firing their weapon in just about every situation. The game has to teach players then that it can be just as amusing nipping into town to pick up some chewing tobacco and hitching a ride home on a passing wagon. The game wants you to know that you should take things slow and not focus on combat at every opportunity, and it uses the snow to force you to do so from the beginning. As a side effect of all of this, Red Dead Redemption 2 was always going to lose a few players before its prologue was even over, though I have to think that Rockstar games were generally fine with that, since anyone who repeatedly struggles to finish that opening is likely to find much of the rest of the game too slow or disinteresting anyway. This might be a legitimately masterful work of art, but it definitely isn't for everyone. And that's okay. In a way, the whole introductory sequence is like the exact opposite of a trial by fire. It's a trial by snow that puts you under minimal pressure with a slow rhythm to ensure that you have what it takes to enjoy the entire adventure. While you can power through the game's main story and encounter plenty of excitement, most of Red Dead Redemption 2's world is designed to be experienced in a pretty unique way. The game wants you to want to talk to your gang. It wants you to hunt and plan, and to be a more cautious, thoughtful criminal. It wants you to know that automatically going in guns blazing won't be the most fun approach. If the game didn't slow you down and keep you focused in the beginning, then far too many players would miss far too much of what it has to offer. As the weather improves throughout Red Dead Redemption 2's initial hours, as the fog clears and the snow starts to melt, the player finds themselves slowly seeing further and chomping at the bit to see even more. At the end of the opening chapter, then, it becomes clear that one of the snow's most important jobs all along was to allow the player to feel unbridled joy at its eventual absence. While the first hour of the game might not hook every player in especially well, I'd wager that after escaping the snow and making it to Horseshoe Overlook, almost every player that has stuck around is fully on board for the rest of this journey. But how do you feel about Red Dead Redemption 2's snowy opening, no matter how many times you've played through it? Let me know in the comments, and please do like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk more stories and more games. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.